Nice pensive portrait of me.
Who is here for the first time?
Look at my pulling power.
Yes. Not enough. Anyway, this is the best kept secret in London. As you can see, you've missed a lot, but you can still catch up. For the summer, up till the summer, we've got Mary Testina tomorrow and Kirsty Young next week. And then in the autumn, we have the promises of people like Kate Moss and John Major and a whole array of people. So after July, you can go on our website and see whom you like to come. I see some very familiar faces at the back. The Greens here for the first time, I hope, especially come from Hong Kong.
Just
They're
for this.
flying back tonight. Listen, the format is very simple. I have I have a conversation with our guest, and then for 20 minutes only, and I'm going to let it open to the floor so that you, the audience, can ask our guest the questions you like, with the only proviso that they got to be either intrusive or impersonal and slightly naughty, but intelligent. So if you know any secrets of Julian Fellowes, you're very welcome to dig it up and wash his laundry in the open.
Oh, dear.
Now, the first question I ask you is this, is that, you know, the world has changed. You are famous for bringing alive some of these extraordinary episodes in history, which about 100 years, 200 years old. And of course, the world has changed so much that particularly the young might not be remotely interested, and indeed they might be totally ignorant of Lord Grantham, of all these other people, what they did in the 19th and the 20th century. But the world is trying to reach out to them, as we know from Mr. Corbyn and everybody else. When you did Belgravia, which is a new kind of drama, where you, like an installment storyteller, would write about something every week, and people can actually go on it and act interactively. Was that deliberately an experiment to see if, in fact, you might garner a younger audience?
No, I wouldn't really say that, because actually one of the funny things about Downton was that we didn't really have an audience profile. We had all ages, we had all nationalities, and, you know, all of that. So I did have we did have a big young audience for that. I think it was really, they came to me, Iran, and they had this idea of mixing essentially the 19th and the 21st centuries, so that we were releasing one chapter a week like Dickens or Thackeray would, but at the same time we had this app, a word I use as if I understood it, and you go on the app and you meet the characters and you do this and you find more about life in the 1840s and blah, blah, blah. And it seemed quite witty to me. Of course, I couldn't operate it. I mean, my son had to actually work it for me so that I could get on the site. But I spend my whole life now sending these pathetic emails saying, why is there a red light on the side of the screen? What does it mean? And so he had to do all that. But I think that was it. I mean, I'm interested in a young audience, but I'm not a great believer in pursuing any kind of audience. I think you have to do your best and write something. I think Spielberg said it, you should only make films you want to see. And I think that's the only guide you have, is to make things or write things or paint things or whatever that you want to look at, you want to see, and hopefully other people will want to see them too, including my wife, who has just arrived.
Well done.
At the back of the show.
But did you have any instant where somebody particularly young, who was impressively young, asked you questions and engaged with you? during the time of Downton Abbey?
Oh yes, no, I had a lot of letters.
Young children, even?
Children watched it. I mean, the letters that interested me more were for sort of teenagers and people of that kind of age. I mean, just very simple things. A lot of them couldn't believe that homosexuality had been illegal at that time. And I wrote back, I said, never mind that time, it was illegal until I was 14. It went right into the 60s. And they found that very, very hard to believe. And there were sort of other issues. I mean, I had a lot of letters from teachers because their pupils, history is very oddly taught at the moment, and they just get these sort of nodules about the Second World War or the Tudors, but there doesn't seem to be any linear narrative connecting up the different periods of history at all now. And what had happened is that a large number of pupils didn't know there was a difference between the two world wars. They thought that was the war, the World War. And Downton, of course, made it quite clear that the World War was specific and was over by the time the 1920s began. I had a lot of letters about that. I mean, it's always nice that, you know, I mean, sometimes a bit surprising, but it's always nice when you feel you've opened up a door a bit and helped people understand something they didn't completely grasp before. But as to why we had our multi-age audience, I think that it's true, as you say, obviously, that the world is very different from what it was 100 years ago, and we do things differently, you know, the past is a foreign country and all that. But there are certain elements that are the same. And falling in love and being ambitious and having lousy parents and marrying the wrong person and not getting on with your children and not knowing why. And, you know, hating your daughter-in-law. I mean, all of this stuff's been going on since the caves. And so they can easily connect as long as you try to keep the stories reasonably generic and they're latching onto emotions that are generally felt. Then I don't think there is such a problem as if you take some incredibly esoteric, if you started to try and do a play about why it was so important at Versailles that you had the right to an armchair instead of a stool, you'd probably lose the young audience fairly rapidly. But I try to avoid anything too arcane, or at least have an emotional story in the middle of it that is comprehensible.
Well, exactly. I mean, you always have old farts writing in and trying to correct you, I know, and it's sometimes rather irritating. But what intrigues me more is this. You speak with such an accent and authority and knowledge, and being the founder of Gosford Park and Downton Abbey and many other period drama. So one gets the perception, especially now that you've become a peer of the realm, as being a right old snob, born of the aristocrats, when you were not, just like P.G. Wodehouse, who was an ordinary bank clerk, who nonetheless captured that aristocratic society and upper class immaculately. Would you say that, or rather, how can you explain the fact that you have actually morphed into this character that you are not? Although in appearance you are everything, every inch, a real old snob.
What a complicated question. I actually think I have a slightly more interesting background than you're crediting me with.
Yes,
and I think it is the reason I got interested in all that side of things. And that is, my parents came from different backgrounds. And my father was, although not a snob, since I think to be posh is not the same as being a snob. You can get it, anyone can be a snob, posh or not posh. But my father came from one of those families in Berks landed gentry and blah, 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 and all his uncles were governors of this and this, or farmers or bishops. And that was his background. But that was not my mother's background. She came from a middle class, civil service background. Her father was in the Postmaster General's department and living, a reasonably comfortable life. She wasn't selling violets in Covent Garden, but she had a different take on the world than his take. Also, conversely, he was very diffident. He wasn't really confident. His own father had died in the Great War when he was 3. His mother was a sort of jazz baby and not very interested in parenting, to put the finer point on it. And he wasn't confident. All his relations were richer than he was. He was always standing at the end of a drive wearing someone else's clothes. Whereas my mother was a great beauty, and various people of the time, what's her name, Leacock, and anyway, various painters painted her. I've got one by Dugdale, who was a fashionable painter in the 30s. She was elected Queen of Speed or something by London University. You know, she was wild and very, very good looking. So she thought any room she was in was lucky to have her. And she had a kind of confidence that he could only dream of. So you have this complete paradox that the smarter born member of the couple is the more diffident and the shyer and the least likely to put himself forward, whereas the middle class woman thinks she owns the world. And this led to a very complicated, larger family background, because his family couldn't stand her. They thought she'd caught him, which she may have done, but they thought she'd caught him. And what they didn't pay any attention to is the fact she made him very happy, which in the end, whether she caught him or not, as far as I'm concerned, pays the bill. But they were very happy, but to some extent they were isolated because his family were horrible to her, and she didn't feel particularly at home in his old world. So he gave up shooting. He gave up a lot of his relations. They spent their weekend in a house called, their honeymoon in a house called Belsic Castle in Northumberland, where some great friends of his grandmother lived. It was not a success. And after that, you have this kind of no man's land they created around themselves. And of course, as a child, I didn't quite understand what was going on. I knew that my great aunts weren't very nice to my mother, but I couldn't put more together than that. But as I grew older, I understood. I understood what she'd been put through. I understood what he'd had to go through on her behalf. And I saw the game that was being played out in all these different and frequently very dishonest ways. And I think that gave me an analytical view of the society we lived in. And after that, I always felt like an observer. Even when I was swept up into them, when I was 18 in those days, this sounds like the other side of the moon, but there was still a London season, and there was an old boy called Peter Townend who ran it, and he used to go through the peerage and the gentry and take out names of young men. This is true. And give these lists out to mothers who were giving dances and cocktail parties. And I was put onto this list. And I did it all. And in fact, my novel, Past Imperfect, is really an account of that year of my life. But I always felt slightly, I was there. Some of them were very nice. Some of them are friends to this day. But I always felt slightly I was a fly on the wall. I was watching how they lived, how they spoke, what they did. And looking back, of course, I now see that as a preparation for a lot of what I did later on.
Well, that was a very fulsome explanation. But what happened to your beauty from your mother?
I know. Actually, funnily enough, my parents had 4 children, 4 sons. 2 of them very good looking. 2 of them with no looks at all. And this was a source of real bewilderment to my mother. And every now and then, she was very affectionate, very loving. But every now and then she used to say, "Are you really our son?" And the truth is, my father was very good looking too. They were a very good looking couple. But they had 2 ugly children and 2 handsome children. And there's no accounting for it.
But actually, I have to be fair, you are not a snob, because I heard you talk about Syrian refugees and immigrants and so forth coming to this country, and you were quite sympathetic and emphatically view that they should have the opportunity to come, and it really doesn't matter that they've come as what people now call economic migrants, because everybody wants a better life in their lives.
I agree. They want a better life. I mean, I think at some point, some element of realism has to come into the matter. But frankly, what's wrong with wanting a better life? You have a family or living in some war-torn hell, and you want to get them out. You want your kids to have a chance. I can't find anything wrong in that. You know, I hope we can help them as much as we can. And I hope all the prosperous West feels the same and feels sympathetic. Yes, there's a funny phrase when they say, oh, they're just economic migrants as opposed to coming from persecution. But I mean, you know, living in Aleppo is persecution, whether they're putting you in prison or anything else. You're living in hell. And as a parent and for yourself, you want a better life. So yes, I do feel that quite strongly.
And in particular, you chastise those whom I call armchair critics, who actually the infiltration of these immigrants makes no difference to their life, and they don't contribute anything. Those are the rich ones who are insulated from all that, and they really shouldn't be criticizing it. So you have a sort of sense of fairness in you.
Yes, I hope so. Of course, when you've been an actor, a lot of all that stuff is ironed out of you, because you live a long time on a whistle and a prayer, hoping for something to happen. And I do think that changes people. When you're living in the arts, when you're trying to make your living in the arts, it's one long struggle. And sometimes the struggle pays off, and sometimes it doesn't. But either way, it's a struggle. And so I didn't have that feather-bedded life that, you know, when you go do 2 years in the army and then you go into a bank. Not that I've got anything against it. If you can make it work for you, that's great. But that wasn't my life. My life was trying to get work in an industry where I was an unfashionable type, and it was a pretty uphill battle. And I think that gives you a sympathy with other people fighting different kinds of uphill battles. I think your heart goes out to them.
You get a lot of rather jealous people, because you're one of the very few, probably the only one, who's managed to make a lot of money out of all this period drama, which everybody thinks is now out of fashion. I mean, you know, we've had Brideshead, we've had upstairs, downstairs, and so forth, and up come Gosford Park, up come Downton Abbey, and in particular, America regard Downton Abbey as the time when Brideshead came out and nobody went out on the night when the episode came out. Has that been a rather satisfying experience?
Well, you know, success is more fun than failure. And it is now. I mean, I think the Downton ride has been a very extraordinary ride for all of us, a kind of magic carpet ride, because we started making, you know, period drama. I thought it would have legs. I thought it would find an audience. But I didn't obviously have the slightest idea of the scale of the whole thing. I mean, I've just got back from Singapore, where we were launching the Downton exhibition, which is scheduled to travel the world. And it's, you know, vast. And these rooms have been reproduced, these kitchens and dining rooms and Carson's pantry and God knows what have all been reproduced. 50 or 70 costumes, all plots, things being projected all around you, you know. And as I was walking around it, we had a private showing on the night we got to Singapore. The surreality of it, the whole thing was so bizarre that one minute you're sitting at a red traffic light wondering what to give Daisy to do this week, and then whoosh, you know, here you are in this extraordinary fantasy. And so I'm very grateful, I'm very glad it happened to me, and I'm sure that for most of the actors, I mean, some of them may go on to be great stars. Lily already more or less is a great star. But I still think they'll look back on it as a pretty happy time. It was fun to be part of. It was rather mad, actually. You'd walk down Fifth Avenue with Mrs. Patmore, and the taxis would kind of screech to a halt, and people, and all of that was going on. And in moments of that, you do think, what are we on, you know? But I mean, it was fun. It was great.
I mean, were you absolutely thrilled when Maggie Smith decided to participate?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, we knew that the key to it was getting a really grade 1 cast at the beginning. And the more you get one, the more you get. So that by the time we had Maggie and Hugh and Jim Carter and all of these people, everyone wanted to be in it. And then you have this, which is also quite not hard to set up, I don't mean in that way, but it's kind of lucky. We got that thing when top actors would come in, like Tim Pickett-Smith, and just do one story and then go. And some series manage that and others don't. It's quite difficult to know whether you're going to be one of the ones that does. But we were able to do that. And that was, again, marvelous. I mean, we had the most terrific
Were you
actors.
involved with the casting?
Yes, because I was also a producer.
You said you had 2 brothers that are ugly, 2 brothers not ugly. Isn't that the
Let's
youngest
get
girl?
back to
She's
the
rather
interesting
ugly.
bit.
I mean, I can't remember her name, the one who was going out with a publisher. I mean,
Yes, Edith.
But did you deliberately choose her to be uglier than the other 3?
No, the trick, if you have a character in a film or a television who is supposed to be plain, the trick of it is to choose someone who is very good looking, but in a different way.
And so,
I mean, in fact, if Laura came into the room now, you'd all think she was absolutely beautiful. But she's very different to Michelle. Michelle has that absolute sort of classic cut glass, almost 1930s film star look, whereas Laura has a much softer look. So the audience can see they're different, but they find them both attractive. An example of that was when they made Jane Eyre in the 40s, and they cast for Jane Eyre Joan Fontaine, one of the most beautiful film stars of that or any other period. But they cast her, put her in plain hair, you know, with sort of scraped back, and all the characters say, oh, it's such a pity she's so plain. And the audience has the sensation of seeing inner beauty because they don't find her plain at all. But all the characters are saying how plain she is. Well, of course, they're not seeing inner beauty, or they may be, but they're also seeing outer beauty. It's a sort of trick of the eye, really. And then you make, in that film, Blanche Ingram, it's all ringlets and curls and it's sort of overdone. So she's supposed to be the beauty, but we prefer Jane. And so we feel clever and sympathetic. Oh, yeah. Edith actually became something of a kind of running, you know, because everything went wrong for her always. And that was why she had to be happy at the end. But there was one time I was in New York and I was in Barnes & Noble, the bookshop on Fifth Avenue, and I was wandering around and going from table to table of books. And I could feel this woman following me. And she came, and I went to the next table, and she came, and I went to the next, she came. And finally I turned to her, I said, can I help? And she said, her lip quivered. Just let Edith be happy.
Did that change your mind?
Well, in those moments, you know, again, you sort of think, where am I? What's happening? But anyway, we did let Edith be happy in the end.
Is it going to be a film?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I don't know any more than you do, really. It seems to me sad if we don't do a film, because I think, you know, most films are a punt, and this film has a reasonably solid audience waiting for it. The difficulty is rounding up the actors who've all gone off to the 4 corners of the earth, and they're on Broadway and in Hollywood and doing plays, and doing series, doing movies, and so on, if we can round them up. But I hope we do a film.
Have you written it, or have you got an idea of what it would be? Because
Well,
obviously you want something different.
I know I have written it, and I mean, I've written the basis of it, because obviously when it becomes a reality and the director steps in, then there are other drafts and then things change. But I did want to sort of get my thoughts straight as to what it might be, because I didn't want to be caught short if they suddenly say, it's greenlit. But yes, I mean, I think it'll be fun.
All right, my last question before I open up to the floor is, the Americans obviously see you doing it so beautifully and successfully with the British. They wanted you to do one of the equivalent of all the tycoons called the Gilded Age. Is that going to happen?
Yes, I hope so. I have this fantasy that I can clear my desk of everything else and just be doing the Gilded Age as opposed to 5 jobs at once, which I have done, but is very kind of draining. And that's the idea. The difficulty when you've been an actor is it's almost impossible to say no, because you've had so many years when you just wanted someone to want you to do something. And I said yes to lots of things, and I'm now trying to get rid of everything I've said yes to, but it is my intention to do the Gilded Age. I think it's an interesting background. I mean, again, it's sort of a study of class, but very different from England. And it's a time when these great fortunes had come out after the Civil War, some of them out of the Civil War, of shipping and gas and copper and, of course, railways almost above all. And these people descended on New York and wanted to be the rulers of the New York society. But old New York society had been a much more modest and rather Puritan affair, centered on modest houses in Washington Square and so on, the old Dutch and English and Scottish settlers. And these two groups fought it out, really, arbitrated by this very interesting woman called Caroline Astor, who felt she was sort of in both camps because she'd been born a Schermerhorn, which was an old Dutch settler family, but she'd married an Astor, which was not brand new money, but fairly new money. And she felt that gave her the right to tell both groups what to do. And what is, in a way, perplexing, but I hope to sort of find an understanding of it in the show, they did it. She had authority over New York for about 30 years, and she kept people out. I mean, people like Jay Gould, who is one of the most successful men who's ever lived in terms of the money he made, she didn't like him. And she kept him out. And she kept his children out until he was dead. And only then did she let them in. And what gave her this power when she wasn't an employer, she was just a woman, Mrs. Astor. But she ruled it, and I love that. I love it when people somehow auto-generate their own power. I mean, people say she was very rich, but New York was full of people who were very rich. And they all wanted to be top dog, and she was top dog. And I just like that as a background for the usual. I mean, then you have the family and their servants, and, oh dear, Daisy's buying a new hat. You know, that comes in on the top of it. But I just like it as a sort of slightly Civil War background to the whole thing. So I hope I do it. It does interest me.
Well, perhaps it was because she was an Astor, because there are obviously aspirations of new money wanting old money. I mean, there are many examples of the aristocracy being seduced, more marrying heiresses, and so forth. So we'll see. We'll look forward to it. Which are the 2 or 3 giants, Henry Ford or Guggenheim, Carnegie, who interest you most?
They're all rather extraordinary men, actually. Frick was an extraordinary man as well.
Frick.
Most of them you don't like very much. There's something about being that single-minded. I don't mean necessarily that they behaved badly, although some of them did, because it was much more of a kind of kill or be killed atmosphere. But on the whole, I think they were a kind of rough lot. And I mean, like Commodore Vanderbilt, in a way I prefer Willie Kay, you know, his son, or Consuelo, the Duchess of Marlborough, a very, very interesting woman, because by then everyone sort of calmed down a bit. But that first generation who makes the fortune, they are these sort of strange, rather frightening, rather alienating giants. But they are giants. They are giants. I mean, they did extraordinary things. But I don't know they're the ones you love, really.
Good. All right, question. Who would like to ask a question?
Hello, I'm Liberty. I was wondering, as an actor, have you got any advice for entering the industry and how I can stand out?
Very boring question. I mean, as if you have a formula.
There
I'm
is-
sure you're going to tell her to hard work.
my advice is be lucky.
Yes.
I mean, on the whole, you have to be ready for when you get a break, and you have to understand that sometimes your break comes in disguise, and it often isn't the lucky break you thought would come, something completely different. And I've seen people turn down what would have been their lucky break because it wasn't what they were after. And I think you have to bear that in mind. But, you know, I'm afraid there's absolutely no doubt that everyone who has any kind of success in the industry has a bit of luck at some point. Someone's ill. You know, I mean, well, for me, although I'm talking about writing rather than my acting career, but I mean, when Robert Altman wanted to make a take on the Country House murder mystery, he went to Tom Stoppard, he went to Christopher Hampton, he went to, they all turned him down. Now, why? I mean, I've always thought it was my dead mother saying, don't do it, you know, and coming to them in a dream. But I can't imagine why they all turned it down. It was going to be Altman's only British film. It would be very unlikely there was another, and of course there wasn't. Now he's dead. And yet, everyone turned it down. And someone called Bob Balaban, who was his producer, had seen a script I'd written that had never been made, and said, well, you know, this is his territory. Maybe you should have a conversation with him. Well, if that isn't luck, I don't know what. And you just have to hope you get a bit of luck.
Very important. And you won an Oscar.
And I won the Oscar. That was lucky too.
First time.
On Downton, did you sign a contract with Maggie Smith to deliver the best lines to her?
Well, of course, Maggie and I have been to the rodeo 2 or 3 times by now. We worked together in Gosford Park. She was in a film I wrote and directed, a family movie called From Time to Time, and then we went on to Downton and 6 years of it. And I think we sort of have each other's rhythm. I mean, I know, I say it sounds rather vain, but I know how to write for her, and by God, she knows how to play what I write. I mean, the very interesting thing about Maggie, one is she never needs to have it explain why it's funny. Sometimes actors say, well, I don't understand. You say, oh, no, it will be funny, I promise you. But she never needs to have it explained. Also, she never changes anything. Because some actors now have a feeling, it started in America, but it's come here a bit now, that they have to alter their lines a bit to make them their own, and they have to add words and everything, which is absolutely fatal for comedy. Because once you put one word in the line, it loses its comedy rhythm, and it isn't funny anymore. But I mean, Maggie, I always remember this, on Gosford, and I really hardly knew her. I was so frightened of her, really. So I didn't sort of interfere with anything. But we were filming the scene when the film producer explains about this film he's making, Charlie Chan, in London. And he's explaining about the film, and there's a dead body, and there's this, and this. And Maggie had the line, how horrid. But who turns out to have done it? And he says, well, I couldn't tell you that, it'd spoil it for you. And she says, but none of us will see it. And we're rehearsing this. And Robert Altman, of course, has worked all his life in film. It's very hard to set up a film. It's very hard to make it. He didn't see why it was funny that nobody would see it. And so he said, I don't think this line is funny. I want to cut this line. I think it just sounds ungenerous. It's not funny. And of course, all the other actors, and they say, oh, yeah, it's not funny at all, Bob. And I was thinking, God, this is a really funny line. It's going to go. And I should have trusted her, because Maggie listened to all this going on, and then she said, I think I can make it work, Bob. And he wasn't going to cross her, so she said the line. And of course, it was in every trailer from then on. And it always got a laugh. But, she just could see it, while the others could not. And that's why she is very rewarding. The other real gift, she's a very gifted actress. She's a great actress. But the extraordinary gift she has is that she can go from comedy to tragedy seamlessly, within a few minutes. And it's just too much for a lot of actors. They have to sort of almost turn into someone else to now be in a comedy scene. But she doesn't turn into someone else. And sometimes she's on that cusp between you're not quite sure whether it's funny or whether it's very moving. There was a marvelous moment when she came in after Sybil's death, and she talked to Carson for a bit, and I made her touch his hand, the only time in 6 years that she actually touched him. And they'd both gone through this terrible, horrible, horrible thing. And she walked across the hall away from him and then stopped, and just before she got to the drawing room door, she sort of drew herself up so that she would go into the room as a strong woman and not as a grieving, sorrowful figure. And I thought when I watched it, what's brilliant about this is that it's almost funny, because it's so violent to want to not be weak and not be wailing, and yet it's also incredibly moving. So, I loved writing for her. I thought she was fantastic. And really all the way through, we never had any flagging bits.
Was she your first choice?
Oh, God, I wrote the part completely for her.
So
yes,
no,
absolutely.
no possibility of approaching Judi Dench or somebody else?
If Judy had played it, I would have said she was the first choice. That's how it works.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi. You said you'd prepared the draft of a script. Okay. For the film. And you've also just said that to make a film is extremely complex. If the film doesn't, for various production reasons, come to fruition, would you readapt what you've already prepared for television series, which, as you know, would be 100% popular and 100% viewed from around the world? Or would you just let it die?
I have to now explain that after a lifetime of bad behavior, I am extremely deaf. So I will now ask my wife to repeat this question.
The question is, if you had written Gosford Park as a screenplay, but it didn't... Oh. She said Gosford Park. No, she's shaking her head. Let me do it, madam. I'm in charge. I know you're the wife.
Struggle.
No, her point is that if you had written a screenplay, it doesn't matter what, and the film did not go, would you actually try to save it and turn it into a television series? Is it? Yes, adapt it. So is it easy for you to adapt a film screenplay into a television series?
Yes, I've certainly done it, and one of them is going into production, I think, although I'm not allowed to say it. But of course, a television series is different because you need 3 endings, not one. You need an arc in each episode as opposed to an overall arc, and technically it's a bit different. But
I was specifically referring to Downton, which you said you've done the draft for, and I wondered, rather than lose it if it doesn't make a film, would you readapt what your draft is?
No. I think Downton as a television series is finished now. We'll either make the film or we won't make the film, or we'll have the musical on stage, or we'll have the ice ballet, or the opera. But I think as a television series, it's finished.
Right, very boring. Question.
May I have 2 questions?
Come on,
No, sorry.
get
May I
on
have
with
2?
it.
Oh, right, yeah. Firstly, where do you keep your Oscar at home? And secondly, is it terribly common now to vote Conservative and terribly smart to be a socialist?
Is it terribly, what was the second?
smart to vote
Socialist,
Conservative.
vote Labour, and a bit common to be Conservative.
I'm not getting this question. I keep at home, I keep all my awards, he said graciously, in the billiard room, because I feel if you sort of put them in the drawing room, then it's like saying, yeah, but the billiard room, you're not doing that thing of saying, oh, it's a doorstop in the garage, you know, which I don't approve of because I think it's ungrateful. I'm very grateful to have an Oscar. I'm very glad I won it.
As a replica.
No.
I thought you had to give it back, and then they give you a replica.
No, the Oscar, you get the real one. There is another award I've got where you give it back and they give you a replica, but not the Oscar. The only thing is you sign a contract. You can only sell it back to the authorities and for $1. So you can't sell an Oscar ever. Now, you can sell one given before about 52, I think, 1952, but now you can't. But anyway, I keep it in the billiard room because I feel then if people say, can I see the Oscar, then that is sort of, they have demonstrated an interest, and so that's sort of okay. But what was the second question?
You want to come up here?
I mean, this is a very complicated question at the moment. I think Jeremy Corbyn, who obviously I don't support because I'm a Tory peer, but I mean, he proved to be a much, much better performer, not only than his opponent, but than anyone expected. And he also tapped into this youth market, and very successfully. And that is very powerful. I'm not sure I would ever willingly apply the word fashion to voting, because I think it is not as frivolous as that. And I think people need to feel not who they like to listen to on the hustings, but what would this party do with the economy? Are they adequately equipped to run a pretty successful capitalist economy? Are they the right people? And that's what we should be thinking about, rather than whether or not they make us laugh. But I don't want to take away from the fact that Corbyn caught everyone on the hop, and he did prove to be very good at the hustings. And, you know, that's worth something. I wish that had been true of our side. And so people have to make a decision, but I would hope they would make a decision on something more than whether or not it's cool.
Is he going to be a character in your film?
Who, Jeremy Corbyn?
Yes.
He's a natural for me, isn't he, really?
Yes, he ought to come to dinner. He should be invited when he's on a northern tour or something.
Well, me and Jeremy, we'll have to see what we can arrange.
Thank you, Lord Fellows.
Lord Fellows.
Oh, Lord Fellows,
yes.
And this gentleman. And Downton Abbey is quite popular in China, especially among Chinese English majors, and some scholars or audience even compared it to, to the Chinese classics story of the stone, or the red mansion, a dream in the red mansion, Hong Long Meng. I'm just wondering, have you ever considered to write a new novel or screenplay that is combined with Chinese culture elements? Because your play or your play, your story is quite popular for Chinese people, so I think they like it very much. Do you have any idea?
Was it popular in China?
Yes, it's quite popular in China, and Downton Abbey is quite like a textbook in Chinese, in Chinese universities.
I think they liked your costumes. I'm not so sure they understood all the claptrap. But, I mean, obviously we had a feudal system in China, and his question is whether you adapt it. But presumably you got better things to do than to try to investigate the culture of Chinese feudalism or class system.
Yes, I'm not sure I would be equipped to write a Chinese version of Downton, but I was very interested that it was so popular in China. I really was. It rather took me by surprise because it was huge in China. And I hoped it was part of China at the moment rediscovering its own history after that period when you were not encouraged to enjoy your own history, which is, of course, a fascinating history, absolutely fascinating and considerably older than Europe. And so I like to feel that Chinese people are now enjoying their own history again. I hope that's
Yes, I mean, it's
part of
like
it.
the other very popular series with Kevin Spacey, House of Cards. I mean, that's a very good reflection of what is happening in contemporary China. And I think that Downton was a great reflection on the feudal system and the class system, you know, during the 17th, 18th, 19th century.
Sure.
So that's why. And they love the costumes. They love the English. They love the cook. You know, can you imagine having a kitchen with Chinese food? Absolutely wonderful. Yes, go on.
Hi, I'm Yue Parkinson on behalf of FT Chinese. My question is, why did you choose Highclere Castle to film Downton Abbey? Is it because Lady Carnarvon has done a really good PR job?
Is it because what?
Lady
Lady
Carnarvon.
Carnarvon has done a good PR job to get the
To
contract.
get you over to there to make her castle so famous.
The Carnarvons have been very hard-working in making the most out of Downton, and I'm very pleased for them. I think it's made Highclere much more of a destination than it was before, and both Lord and Lady Carnarvon have worked very, very hard. But of course, that's all after the event. The reason I chose, well, I say we chose Highclere. I had wanted to use Highclere for a long time. I wanted to use it in Gosford Park. I wanted to use it even before that in a version of Little Lord Fauntleroy, because I find it's such an expression of aristocratic superiority, with its mottos around the roof level, and you go in and coats of arms everywhere and all of that. And I knew we were going to be doing a series that was touching on the decline of the British aristocracy and its social role and how it had kind of led the 19th century. At least the aristocracy was the shop window of the empire. It wasn't actually running the empire. That was really the gentry and the upper middle class, but it was the shop window, and we were coming in at the end of that. And it seemed to me quite witty to have this kind of trumpeting of aristocratic values as the house was falling in, essentially. But also it's very good for a screen narrative, because although it's obviously a large house, it's very straightforward. You go in, there's the central hall, the two libraries, the drawing room, we didn't use the smoking room, the staircase, the door to the kitchens and servants' quarters, the dining room. Now, by the time you've watched one episode, you know how the house works. And you don't sort of have to think, where are we now? I don't understand. And the bedrooms are the same. They all come off this passage that goes around, this gallery that goes around the top of the hall. So it's very clear. So those were the two reasons I was keen on it. And I tried to persuade them, but we went off and saw about 370 houses. The one thing I was very keen on was that we took a house which was still in the possession of the family, because I knew we didn't have the resources to put into an empty house what those houses have to make it look like Downton Abbey. And so what we did is we used all the Herbert family up and down the staircases and in the library and so on, and they kind of became Crawleys, because they just became the ancestors of the characters acting in the rooms, and that was very important. But Highclere has always been in the possession of that family, so it fitted that requirement.
Did it bother you that it's bad feng shui with all that Tutankhamun stuff?
Well,
Did you see a ghost ever?
I don't really believe in all that Tutankhamun curse and all the rest of it. But perhaps one should. I mean, the only thing is that the main character in it, Carter, never had any bad luck at all. Whereas I feel he should have been the one who died of the tsetse fly. So I don't know.
All right. Yes. One in the back and then one in the front.
Oh, thank you. I'm thrilled to hear you speak tonight, so thank you. I was wondering what contemporary figures or a contemporary period would you write about that intrigues you?
Do I write contemporary? Oh, I really like periods of change, times when things shift. And, I mean, all periods are periods of change, but there are some periods in which change is accelerated. A modern period that I would rather like to do is the 60s, because the 60s was not, if you lived through it, as it is now represented on Channel 4. What people forget is the 60s was just after the 50s. In the 50s, most women wouldn't leave the house without a hat and gloves. And we're expected to believe that 7 or 8 years later, they were all rocking around with Marianne Faithfull on a Mars bar. I mean, that's just not plausible. And in fact, if you were living in that period, it was a Janus time, facing both ways. In some ways, it was incredibly traditional and old-fashioned and almost pre-war. And in other ways, it was suddenly this weird kind of wacky happening place with girls riding naked, covered in shaving foam down Carnaby Street, you know. And it was an extraordinary mixture. And that is a time I would like to tackle. But I mean, we're talking as if I never do anything contemporary. Actually, my own favorite piece of my own work, if I'm allowed to say that, is a film called Separate Lives, which is completely contemporary and also isn't about class. It's about self-knowledge, or the lack of it, which is another theme that I find very interesting, how some people can be in a situation. Not only do they not know themselves, they don't apparently know their wives or husbands or children. They don't seem to know what is happening around them in their own life. And that always interests me when I see it happening. But you know, again, I mean, I had a lot of fun, as you can imagine, coming out from under all those footmen and ladies' maids. I had a lot of fun doing School of Rock. And that was a complete break, and suddenly rather a kind of relax, really, sort of wild. I was in New York a lot because we opened it there. And that was fun. You know, I loved it.
Thank you, Sir David. You've been amazing. And Lord Fellers, little Sophia Jarrett asked me to ask you a question. What age did you start performing? And I think she'd love to sing your song, please.
I must be what? Yeah, I've told them. They know that. Well, I used to, you know, do those terrible plays in the attic, you know, and my parents' friends would come for dinner or to stay the weekend, whatever, and they would be forced up into the attic where my brother and I would play out some hopeless thing that I had written or he'd written. And then stagger down with relief and have another huge gin to get over it. So that was the sort of beginning. But I mean, after that, I was in school plays. You know, when I was 9, I was in Alice Through the Looking Glass, and I played the Duchess. And, you know, the one who has the baby or whatever. And I really enjoyed it. It was the first time I'd really sort of got it, and that sort of freedom of acting, that suddenly it's yours, this is your place, and you can kind of do what you want. And then I acted through school, and I acted a bit in Cambridge, and then at the end, I decided to become an actor. I mean, kind of to my own surprise. I don't even now really remember why, but I then got a place in drama school. I went to Webber Douglas, which is now closed, but wasn't bad, because I thought, I'm not going to tell my parents if I don't get in. There's no point in having the battle, and then it's all a bit pathetic. So I waited till I had a place. And then I remember my mother's, we were driving back, actually. She just picked me up at the end of university and put all the cases in the car, and she was driving, and she said, now what are you going to do with it? Have you given it any thought, you know? And I thought, well, okay, it's time. I have to tell her. So I said, I'm going to be an actor. I've got a place in drama school. The course is 2 years, 2 terms. You'll have to pay the fees. It begins on January, and that's it. It's settled. You won't persuade me out of it. So she drove for a bit in silence, and then she said, don't tell your father. Of course, I had to tell, she said, I'll tell him, and She did tell him in the end. But she told him when I was driving away for an 8-week holiday, staying with different people, and then I was going to see him at the end of the holiday. And of course, as she realized, nobody can stay angry for 8 weeks. It's not possible. So by the time I saw him again, he calmed down. But they were very good, actually. They were very good. They followed me to see me play the butler coming out and saying the carriage awaits and all that stuff, you know. The only thing they did do, which is interests me because I don't think we do it now. I think we're not as tough as parents. But they absolutely cut off any allowance. At the end of drama school, I was on my own. I could live at home for nothing. I mean, they weren't that draconian, but no money. And I cheated a bit. I used to ring my mother, you know, are you coming down this weekend, darling? Well, I will. I think the handbrake's still working. You know, what do you mean? What do you mean? Well, the brakes have gone a bit, but I think I can manage with the handbrake. Oh, darling, get it mended. Haven't got any money. I'll pay. Don't tell your father. So there was always a little bit of that. But nevertheless, I was self-supporting.
All right, I'll give you half a minute to sing a song, quickly.
The sun will come out tomorrow. Bet your bottom dollar that tomorrow there'll be sun. Just thinking about tomorrow clears away the cobwebs and the sorrow. Till there's none, when I'm stuck with a day that's grey and lonely, I just stick up my chin and grin and say, oh, the sun will come out tomorrow, so you gotta hang on till tomorrow. Come what may, tomorrow, I love you, tomorrow, you're always a day away.
Thank you.
Sign this girl. You must get down to see if you can be in the cast, because you know it's a hit at the moment, the revival. And they always have to keep changing the cast, because in London, you have to have 4 casts when you have children because of the union regulations. So, you know, in School of Rock, we have 4 casts.
Good.
Very good. Well done.
Back to the film, what does the storyline and characters focus on? What would you want to develop from Downton?
Sorry, what?
I didn't understand that question.
In the Downton Abbey film, from
In the Downton Abbey film,
from the script you've written so far,
from the script you've written so far,
where do you take the characters and storyline?
where do you take character and storylines?
I don't think it's terribly likely that I would answer that question, is it?
Okay, one at the back and then one in the front and one more, so 3 more.
I heard that some of the storylines in Downton were based on truth. For example, I think Lady Mary, when she was bonking to death the Turkish man. So how much of your storylines do you take from researched fact versus your own imagination?
Well, I think it's always a mixture. It's quite hard to determine, because sometimes you take a character particularly that's rather interested you, or an event, but then you change the sexes of people, you know, so you always kind of wrap it up a bit. Mary's disaster with the Turk was interesting because someone said once on television, of course, that's completely impossible. And in fact, it was one of the only storylines that was 100% true. And in fact was discovered in the diary of a friend of ours who lived in a great house, and he found his great aunt's diary. It was the 1890s, a little bit earlier than we portrayed it. And in this particular house, lots of houses had bachelor corridors for single men, but this one had a passage that was only for women. And so it was sort of widows and young girls and dowagers and so on. And one night, a woman had smuggled one of the men in the house party into her room, and he died on the job. And of course, she was completely stuck. She thought, God, what on earth am I going to do? And finally, having sort of sat there for a bit, she got up, she woke the woman up next door, who is a kind of blameless matron, and was shocked and horrified. However, she knew at once that if this story got out, it would be all over London by Friday, and they would all have figured in this scandalous house party. So they woke the other women up along the passage, and this gaggle of dowagers and debutantes took this body the length of the house and got it into the right bed. And he looked up his great-grandfather's diary, and on the same day it just said, poor nice Mr. Thing was found dead in his bed by his valet. It was such a tragedy on Sunday morning. We were all so sorry. And so they got away with it. And of course that generation, unlike our own, kept their own secrets. And it never got out. But as they were telling me, this is long before Downton, but as she was telling me, I thought, one day I will have a use for this story. And I think you also, situations, you know, in your family or whatever it is. And I mean, I was very keen to have sisters not getting on, because normally in Hollywood films, sisters always adore each other and they're always their best friends. Well, this does happen, and I know people who love their family and ring them up every day into their 50s and 60s, and it's all as cozy as you like. But it is by no means always the case, and certainly wasn't the case with us. And in fact, when you dislike your sibling, because you're together so much in a way you can't control, you grow to hate them because you can't get away from them. And so I deliberately wanted the Mary-Sybil relationship, not Mary-Sybil, Mary-Edith relationship to be very prickly and uncomfortable, and then to have the one peacekeeping sibling who gets on with everyone. And that we had. So that again was taken from my own life, except in my case it was brothers and not sisters.
Okay, quickly. Second last question.
Okay, I'm going to try fit in two cheeky questions. First one is, what is your guilty pleasure? And the second one is, you've been quite vocal in the past about inheritance rules. Do you think we're getting any closer to having that changed in the future?
What's the first one? My guilty pleasure. I don't think I'd better say it. Because then it might find its way onto the internet and it would no longer be a secret. I mean, I do rather. I think, in a sense, my sort of public guilty pleasure is that I know I would rather be watching an old film with a takeaway than be at some 5-hour version of Hamlet, you know. And that one's never supposed to admit that, but I mean, it's certainly true in my case. But as for inheritance, you mean women inheritance? We were talking about it. I mean, I think it's a funny area, really. It is very complicated to suddenly have a law that changes everything when people have been living in expectation of inheritance for most of their adult life. I don't think you could do that. But on the other hand, it seems extraordinary to me that women in the British aristocracy, as long as it's after the medieval titles, or in Scotland before the Act of Union, they're okay, but after the Act of Union, have literally no legal reality at all. They have no rights. They essentially don't exist. And that, in 2017, seems quite peculiar to me, that nobody sees even the need to ameliorate it, even if they didn't entirely reform it, to take a step towards it, would seem to me logical. But, you know, who am I and what do I know?
Well, I mean, it only really matters to titles, really. So you are one probably quite relaxed primogeniture.
I mean, ideally, if we're really talking about this, ideally, I would adopt, as a preliminary stage, the Scottish system before the Act of Union. So a boy if there is a boy, a girl if there isn't a boy. Because I think that would disturb arrangements much less, and I think it would at least allow women to have legal reality. Then the next generation can build on that, as opposed to remaining in a situation which seems to me quite unsuitable to modern law. But, you know.
What do you get? What would you do with a transsexual?
This is a test.
All right, last question. You can think about it.
Yes, I felt slightly treacherous this evening because when asked when I was coming, where I was going tonight, I said, I'm off to see Lord Kilwillie. And it's certainly a guilty pleasure of mine anyway. How did you come up with that name, and are you trying to tell us something?
No, Kilwillie actually was one of the few original characters in the novel, The Monarch of the Glen, by Come to Mackenzie, that's right. I mean, not much, to be honest, of the original novel survived into the television series, but a few of the names did, and Kilwillie was one of them. I enjoyed playing Kilwillie. I didn't write it. It was nothing to do with me, the scripting of it. But it was my first taste of being a little bit famous, of being recognized, because it was very popular, the show. And it was the first time when I had taxi drivers say, you know, when are you going to marry Molly, you know, and all of this stuff. And I rather enjoyed it, actually. It was a nice show. It was a kind of warm, friendly show. You wrap up a weekend. You don't have to suddenly be horrified or shocked or whatever. You just sink a bottle of Corrida and put your feet up, you know. And I've got nothing against that kind of television. I enjoy it myself. So, but it was fun. It was nice. My mother was Scottish, so I enjoyed being in Scotland. And I was in it for about 5 years. And we would spend kind of March to November in Scotland, up and down. I was in, I think we did 10 episodes, and I was in 7 or 8. You know, I did have 1 or 2 off. But it was a very nice job. And then during the second series, I wrote Gosford Park. In the third series, I started late because I just collected the Oscar. You know, it went on like that. It was all very sort of mad.
All right, well, I'm afraid we've overrun, in fact, but with pleasure, guilty pleasure. And will you please all join me in thanking Julian Fellowes.
Thank you very much. Very good. Thank you.
Sign that.
Yeah. I know, all right. Very good.